By the end of April 1945, the SS troops dug into the cellars around the Reich Chancellery, thought thick concrete and 4 meters of rubble would keep them alive. Then the sky started screaming. A single Soviet launcher, 12 metal rails bolted to the back of an American truck, fired 12 300mm rockets in a single ripple. Each warhead carried 52 kilograms of steel and almost 29 kilograms of high explosive. The launchers came in pairs, then in batteries, then in entire brigades. For 5 days, from the 26th of April to the 30th, more than 2,000 of these rockets fell on the central district of Berlin. They were aimed at the buildings Hitler had ordered held to the last man: the Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, the bunkers under the Tiergarten, the bridges over the Spree. The Germans called every Soviet rocket weapon Stalin-Orgel, Stalin's organ. The lighter Katyusha rockets had been screaming over their trenches since 1941, but this thing was different. This thing was twice the caliber, with a warhead heavy enough to collapse the front wall of a 4-story building in one shot. The Red Army called it Andryusha, Little Andrew, the big brother of the Katyusha. And by the end of those 5 days, the men holding central Berlin would not surrender to infantry, or to tanks, or to artillery. They would surrender because the rockets had burned out everything around them. This is the story of the BM-31-12, the heavy rocket launcher the Soviets aimed straight at Hitler's last SS bodyguards, and the 5 days in April when it broke the back of the Berlin defense. To understand why this weapon existed at all, you have to go back to 1942. The Red Army already had the Katyusha, the famous truck-mounted launcher firing 132mm rockets in long, screaming volleys. It was cheap, it was mobile, and it terrified German infantry the moment they heard the launch. But by the second year of the war, Soviet commanders wanted something heavier. The Katyusha could shred infantry in the open. It could not crack a fortified building. And the Red Army was about to spend the next 3 years assaulting fortified buildings, fortified villages, fortified cities, all the way to Berlin. The answer was the M30 rocket, a 300mm monster, almost 2.5 times the diameter of the Katyusha round. The first version was so heavy that the Red Army did not even bother building a truck launcher for it. They fired it straight out of its wooden shipping frame, propped on the ground at an angle, by means of an electric igniter. It worked. It was clumsy and slow and dangerous to the crews who had to drag the frames around under fire. But it worked. By 1944, the engineers at the SKB compressor plant in Moscow, the same bureau that had designed every Katyusha mount in service, were ordered to build a proper truck-mounted launcher for the improved M31 rocket. Better engine, better range, same brutal warhead. They welded a framework of 12 rails, 2 rows of 6, to a flat truck bed. The truck they chose was not Soviet. It was American. A Studebaker US-6, 6-wheel drive, 3 axles, sent under Lend-Lease through Iran and the Arctic convoys. The same chassis the Red Army had already standardized on for the Katyusha. The launcher was accepted into service in June of 1944. By the end of the war, 1,807 of them had been delivered. The crews who served them called it Andryusha. And the first job for Andryusha, on the scale that mattered, was Berlin. By late April of 1945, the Soviet First Belarusian Front was inside the city. 3 armies were doing the closing work: the 3rd Guards Army to the south, the 8th Guards Army in the southeast, under General Vasily Chuikov, the same commander who had held the rubble of Stalingrad for 5 months in 1942, and the 3rd Shock Army to the north, under General Kuznetsov, the formation that would physically storm the Reichstag. Reinforcing those 3 armies were the heavy Guards mortar brigades. Truck after truck of BM-31-12 launchers, each one carrying 12 of the 300mm rockets, with the reload trucks rolling close behind. What they were aimed at was the last hard core of Hitler's regime. The defenders of central Berlin were not the worn-out conscripts the Red Army had been bulldozing through since the Vistula. They were, in the main, SS, and they had been told there would be no retreat. Holding the immediate government quarter, the area the Germans called the Zitadelle, the citadel, was a force the Wehrmacht had named Kampfgruppe Monke. About 2,000 men, built around the Berlin garrison of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte. Their commander, Wilhelm Monke, had been appointed personally by Hitler as battle commander for the central government district. His job was to keep the Russians out of the Reich Chancellery and the bunker beneath it for as long as possible. A few hundred meters away, in the wreckage of the Tiergarten and along the Straße des 17. Juni, were the remains of the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland. They had been ordered into Berlin from the eastern suburbs on the 16th of April. By the 22nd, the division's commander had been killed, and the SS Brigadeführer Gustav Kuchenberg had been flown in to take over. He set up his headquarters in the Opera House. By that point, Nordland had perhaps 8 Tiger tanks left, dug in around the Victory Column, ordered to hold the Tiergarten at all costs. Inside the Reich Chancellery itself, sharing the bunker corridors with the last of Hitler's secretaries, were the survivors of the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division, the French SS, the unit called Charlemagne. Their numbers had been reduced to a few hundred men. Around the SS Corps, packed into the cellars and the upper floors, were the Volkssturm, the German last resort militia. Old men, teenage boys, factory workers, walking wounded, roughly 60,000 of them across the city. Most of them had been given a Panzerfaust and 1 day of training. They were told the rocket launchers and the flak towers and the cellars would keep them alive long enough for the relief armies to break through. The flak towers were the cornerstone of that belief. 3 enormous concrete blocks built into the parks of Berlin during the air war. Walls 3 meters thick. The biggest, the Zoo flak tower, was 2 kilometers from the Reichstag and mounted 8 12.8 centimeter heavy anti-aircraft guns on its roof, arranged in 4 twin mounts. The Germans believed nothing would touch the towers. Nothing the Western air forces had dropped on them had ever broken through. That belief was about to be tested by something the Western air forces did not use: a 300mm rocket fired at point-blank range from a truck 400 meters away. The Soviet plan for the BM-31-12 in central Berlin was not the open country saturation pattern the launchers had used in earlier offensives. The streets were too narrow, the lines of fire too short, the buildings too close. So the Guards mortar brigades did something different. They positioned the launchers in cleared blocks of rubble or in courtyards. They aimed not at squares full of infantry, but at specific buildings: reinforced cellars, government offices, the approaches to the Spree bridges, where the SS counterattacks were forming up, the Moltke Bridge, the Weidendammer Bridge, the Kaiser Wilhelm Bridge. Then they used what their own field reports called the staggered salvo. First launcher, 12 rockets in a single ripple into the front face of a building. The wall came down. The Soviet officers waited 30 seconds. Second launcher, also 12 rockets, into the same building, this time through the gap the first salvo had opened. The interior collapsed, the cellars filled with brick dust and burning timber. By the time Soviet infantry moved up, the defenders inside were either dead, deafened, or running for the back exit straight into Soviet machine gun fire. One Berlin defender, writing later, said the impacts felt like a giant plough tearing up the city. A first Belarusian front artillery report on the rocket employment around the Reichstag and the Spree bridges, archived in the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense, praised the BM-31-12 salvos for burning out enemy resistance nodes. That is the exact phrase. Burning out. Not destroying, not suppressing. Burning out. Day 1 of the bombardment, the 26th of April, the rockets were aimed at the southern approaches to the Tiergarten and the eastern approaches to Mitte, the work of clearing the outer crust of the central district. Volkssturm positions in apartment blocks. SS strongpoints in the U-Bahn stations. Anti-tank guns in the side streets. The targets were close enough that Soviet infantry could see the rocket trails go over their heads. Day 2, the 27th, the launchers shifted their fire into the Tiergarten itself. Nordland's last Tigers were dug in around the Victory Column and along the wide axis road of the Straße des 17. Juni. The trees had been blasted to stumps, and the ground was a churn of craters from a week of artillery preparation. The rocket salvos chewed into what was left. Nordland's grenadiers, already down to scattered platoons, lost most of their remaining strongpoints in a day. Day 3, the 28th. The 8th Guards Army under Chuikov fought its way onto Potsdamer Platz. 400 meters from the Reich Chancellery, Monke's defensive perimeter was now small enough that a Soviet rocket fired from beyond the Landwehr Canal could land on top of the bunker complex. The defenders inside the Reich Chancellery cellars could feel the impacts in the walls. Day 4, the 29th. The Soviets cleared the Moltke Bridge over the Spree. This was the key crossing for the assault on the Reichstag itself. The defenders had wired it for demolition and fortified the buildings on the north bank, including the Interior Ministry, the building Soviet soldiers nicknamed Himmler's House. The BM-31-12s on the Moabit bank fired straight across the river into Himmler's house at almost flat trajectory. By that evening, Monke's defended perimeter was under 1 square kilometre. The Reichstag was the next target. Day 5, the 30th of April, was the assault. The 3rd Shock Army's 150th Rifle Division, under Major General Vasily Shatilov, was given the job. The plan was simple. Saturate the Reichstag and the buildings around it with rocket and artillery fire until the upper floors were untenable. Then send the infantry in. The BM-31-12 brigades on the Moabit bank fired ripple after ripple. The defenders in the Reichstag, supported by point-blank fire from the heavy guns on the Zoo flak tower 2 kilometers away, fought back. Even with the rocket bombardment burning out the upper floors, the SS and Volkssturm in the cellars held until the evening. Soldiers of the 150th, including the men whose names would later become famous, fought their way to the roof and raised the victory banner. That same evening, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, 400 meters away, Hitler shot himself. The next 2 days were the collapse. Krukenberg's last Tiger was knocked out trying to cross the Weidendammer Bridge in a breakout attempt. The French SS of the Charlemagne, who had fought a literal block-by-block defense of the Reich Chancellery approaches, were finally overrun or killed. Monke himself, with what was left of his command, broke out of the citadel only to be captured within hours. On the morning of the 2nd of May, in a building on Schulenburg Ring, the German general Helmut Weidling, the commander of the entire Berlin defense, walked into General Chuikov's headquarters and signed the unconditional surrender of the city. The discussions ended at 23 minutes past 8 in the morning. The men who had been ordered to hold central Berlin to the last man had been broken in 5 days. Not by tanks, not by infantry assault, by a saturation rocket bombardment from a weapon system most of them had never even heard of by name. Andryusha did not single-handedly take Berlin. The Soviet infantry had to walk in and clear every cellar, every staircase, every barricade, often at terrible cost. The 8th Guards Army alone took more casualties in those last weeks than many Western armies took in the entire war. But the BM-31-12 was the weapon the SS could not answer. The Germans had their own rocket mortar family, the Nebelwerfer, the vapor caster. The 15-centimeter Nebelwerfer 41 and 42 had been a serious morale weapon against Soviet infantry earlier in the war. But they fired 150mm rockets, half the caliber of the M31, less than a quarter of the warhead, ton for ton. There was no German equivalent to the Soviet 300mm blast. By 1944 and 45, the only German response was tactical. Spread the troops out, dig deeper. Counter the launchers with artillery fire after they revealed themselves. Hope to spot the trucks while they reloaded. Against a careful enemy on open ground, those tactics worked, partly. Inside a city, against an enemy that had brought 1,800 launchers and tens of thousands of rockets to the gates, those tactics meant nothing. The Berlin operation was Andryusha's high point in Europe, but not its last action of the war. 4 months later, in August of 1945, the BM-31-12s moved east. Soviet Far East forces, opening the Manchurian strategic offensive against Japan, used the launchers to smash through the fortifications of the Japanese Kwantung Army in the bunker belts along the border. The same weapon that had cracked the cellars of Berlin cracked the concrete pillboxes of Manchuria. After the war, the BM-31-12 disappeared faster than most Soviet weapons. There was a political reason. The launcher rode on a Lend-Lease American Studebaker, and the terms of Lend-Lease required the trucks to go back to the United States after the war. The Red Army responded by building a domestic copy on the new Soviet ZIS-151 truck. But by then, the engineers were already working on the next generation. The Andryusha was replaced first by the BM-14, a 140mm launcher, and then by the BM-24, a 240mm weapon, both of them post-war designs with better range and better accuracy. The huge M31 rocket, brilliant for cracking buildings at 4 kilometers, was simply not what the Cold War battlefield needed. But it kept selling. Soviet allies wanted heavy rockets for their own assault problems. The BM-31-12 and its descendants ended up in China, in North Korea, in Vietnam, in Egypt. The Korean War saw them used against United Nations defensive positions on hilltops. The Vietnam War saw them used against fortified outposts. Anywhere there was a fortified position to be cracked open by saturation fire, the 300mm rocket still made sense. Today, the surviving examples are mostly in Russian and former Soviet military museums, sitting in the World War II artillery sections, often labeled generically as Katyusha or simply BM-31. The casual visitor walks past them without realizing what they are looking at. What they are looking at is the weapon that finally turned the heavy cellars and concrete government buildings of Berlin against the men hiding inside them. The weapon that turned the SS defense plan, the plan that said the Reich Chancellery and the flak towers and the bunkers would absorb any conventional shelling, into a death trap. The Volkssturm in those cellars, dragged out of factories and old folks' homes a week before, believed the walls would protect them. The SS officers above them said the same thing. They were wrong because of a weapon they could not see, fired from a truck they could not reach, by crews they would never identify. For 5 days in April 1945, the heavy rockets of Andryusha tore through central Berlin, 1 block at a time, and when the smoke cleared, Hitler was dead, the Reichstag was Soviet, and the war in Europe had 11 days left to run. If you want the story of how the Soviet Union also rolled this same kind of saturation firepower against the Japanese in Manchuria, smashing through the bunker belt of the Kwantung Army in the last week of the war, click the video on screen. Subscribe to the channel for more deep cuts on the artillery, the rockets, and the armor that actually decided the Second World War.